Chapter 2. Harry and Lady Amelia took their leave, and the older woman closed the breakfast-room doors with a sigh. Harry smiled. Lady Amelia turned back to her in time to see the smile and returned it ruefully. "Very well, we will leave the men to do their uncomfortable waiting alone. I am going to visit Mrs. McDonald, and you are going to go riding with Beth and Cassie and bring them back here for luncheon." "Perhaps, under the circumstances," began Harry. But Lady Amelia shook her head. "I see no reason why we should not. If he is here, those girls have very pretty manners, and are just whom I would—" "I see no reason why you should not. If he is here, and those girls have very pretty manners, and are just what I would invite if I were to have a formal dinner." And here her smile broadened, because, as mischievous as the girls, if he has brought his 1,000 best men, we shall be terribly short of women, and you know how I dislike an unbalanced table. "I shall have to invite Mrs. McDonald as well. Have a pleasant ride, dear." Harry changed her riding clothes into a riding clothes and mounted her placid pony, already bridled and saddled and held for her by one of the Residency's many servants, and rode off in a thoughtful mood towards her meeting with her two friends. She wondered first what and how much she should tell Cassie and Beth, and second, found herself hoping that Corlanth would stay at least long enough for her to see him. Would a Witch King look any different than any other man? The sun was already hot. She pushed her hat back long enough for the cautious squint at the sky. It was more dun-colored than blue, as if it, like everything else near Ishtan, was faded by the fierceness of the sun. It looked as hard as a curved shell overhead, and brittle, as if a thrown lance might pierce it. The placid pony shuffled along, ears flopping, and she stared out over the sands. The woods to the west of her father's house were old, hundreds of years old, tangled with vine and creeper. Ancient trees had died, and not having room to fall, crumbled where they stood. No landlord had thought the old forest worth clearing and the land put to use, but had made a wonderful jungle for herself and Dickie as children, to be bandits in, hunt dragons in. Its twisted shadows had always been welcome to her. When she grew older, she liked the feeling of the great age that the forest gave her, of age and of a vast, complicated life that had nothing to do with her, and she need not try to decipher it. The desert, with the sharp-edged mountains around it, was different from what she was accustomed to as any landscape could be. Yet she found, after only a few weeks in Ishtan, she was falling by degrees in love with it, and the harsh sand, the hot sun, the merciless, gritty winds, and she found that the desert lured her as her own Greenland never had. But what a discovery it lured her towards, she could not say. It was an even greater shock to realize she was no longer homesick. She missed her occupation, and even more she missed her father. She had left so soon after the funeral that it was difficult to believe he was dead, that he was not still riding around the estate in a shabby coat waiting for her to return. Then she found that she remembered her parents together again, as if her mother had died recently, or her father 5 years ago, or as if the difference which had been so important no longer mattered. She didn't dream of honeysuckles and lilac. She remembered them with affection, but she looked across the swirled sand and small obstinate clumps of brush, and was content with where she was. A small voice whispered to her that she didn't have to ever go home again. She wanted to cross the desert and climb into the mountains to the east, the mountains no homelander had ever even climbed. She often speculated about how other people saw the land here. Her brother never mentioned it one way or another. She was accustomed to hearing the young people refer to that hateful desert and the dreadful sun. Beth and Cassie didn't. They had lived in one part or another of Daria for most of their lives, except the 3 years our mom took us home to acquire polish, she said, and to them, Darien sun and Darien weather, whether it be on the fertile red earth of the south, or the eternal fight against the jungle to keep the fields clear, or the cool, humid plateaus of the orange plantation, or the hot sun of the northeast border, were simply things that were part of their homes to be accepted and adjusted to. Harry had asked them how they liked the homeland, and they had to pause about it. It was very different, Cassie said at last. Beth nodded. Cassie started to say something else, stopped and shrugged. Very different, she repeated. Did you like it? Pursued Harry. Of course, said Cassie, surprised. We all liked the places we've lived, said Beth, once we've made some friends. I liked the snow in the north, offered Cassie, and the fur coats we had to wear there in the winter. Harry gave it up. The older people of the station seemed to put up with the land around them as they would put up with any other disadvantage of their chosen occupation. Darwinian service, civilian and military, bred stoicism in those who didn't give up and go home after the first few years. The green owls, making the best of it attitude, was almost as tangible as mosquito netting. Harry had once won an admission from Mr. Peterson, Cassie and Beth's father. There were several people to dinner at the Residency that evening, among them the Petersons. Mr. Peterson had been seated across from her at dinner, and had not appeared to pay any attention to the conversation on the other side of the table. But later in the evening he appeared at her side. She was surprised. He rarely spoke enough at social gatherings, as was notorious around the station for avoiding young unattached ladies, including his daughter's friends. They sat in silence at first. Harry wondered if she should say anything, and if so, what. She was still wondering when he said, I can't help hearing some of what that young chap next to you was saying at dinner. He stopped again, but this time she waited patiently for him to continue and did not try to prompt him. I wouldn't pay too much attention if I were you. The young chap in question had been telling her about the hateful desert and the dreadful sun. He was a subaltern at the fort and had been there for 2 years. Was looking forward to his escape in 2 years. The subaltern had continued, but I wouldn't want you to think we have no change of seasons here. We do. We have winter, it rains steadily for 3 months, and everything gets moldy, including you. Mr. Peterson said, I'd rather like it here. There are those of us who do, you know. He then stood up and wandered away. She had not spoken a word to him. But she remembered what he said later, as she realized that she too was becoming one of those who liked it here. She pondered who else might be in their select club. It was a game, and she amused herself with it when she ran out of polite conversation. She took mental note of those who did not complain about the heat, the wind, the unequal rainfall, and then tried to separate those like herself who actually enjoyed being scratchy with blown sand and headachy from the glare, from those like Cassie and Beth who were merely cheerfully adaptable. Harry at last settled on Colonel Dedham as the most likely member of her club, began to wonder if there was any way to broach the subject with him. She thought that perhaps there was a club rule that read, Thou shalt not speak, but her chance came at last, less than a fortnight before Corlant's messenger arrived at the Residency at 4 a.m. It was at another small dinner party at the Greenhouse, when the gentlemen brought themselves and an appalling reek of Sir Charles's finest cigars into the dining room to join the ladies. Colonel Dedham came across the room and tossed himself down on the window seat beside Harry. She had been looking out on the mysterious white pools the moon poured across the desert. Open the window a bit, he said, and let some of the smoke out. I can see poor Amelia being brave. Cigars should be like onions, she said, unfastening the catch, pushing back the pane. Either the whole company does or the whole company doesn't. Dedham laughed. Poor Melly. She would spoil many a party, I fear. Have you ever smoked a cigar? She smiled with a glint in her pale eyes, and he reflected that some of the young men had labeled her cold and humorless. Yes, I have. That is how I know. My father was used to giving dinners for his hunting friends, and I would be the only woman there. I was not going to eat in my room like a punished child, and I liked to stay and listen to the stories they told. They permitted themselves to become accustomed to my presence, because I could ride and shoot respectably, but the smoke after a few hours would become unbearable. So your father? Prompted him. No, not my father. He taught me to shoot against his better judgment, but he knew the line at teaching me to smoke. It was one of his friends, Richard's godfather, in fact. He gave me a handful of cigars at the end of one of those very thick evenings and told me to smoke them slowly and carefully somewhere where I could be sick and private. And the next time the cigars went on the table, I was to take one for myself, and he'd help me stand up to my father. It was the only way to survive. I was right. I shall have to tell Charles, said Dedham, grinning. He is always delighted to find another cigar lover. Her gaze wandered back to the moonlight, but now she turned back. No, thank you, Colonel. I am I am not that. It was the stories that made it worth it. I only appreciate smoke when I'm seeing things in it. I know what you mean, but you must promise not to tell Charles that, he replied. For heaven's sakes, call me Jack. 3 months is quite long enough to be called Colonel more often than business demands. She said. Cassie and Beth do it very nicely. Say Jack. Jack, she said. There, you see? Or for the next lesson, I will walk across the room and ask you to say it again, and you will see how quickly I turn around and say yes. She laughed. It was hard to remember that Dedham was a few years older than Sir Charles. The latter was portly and dignified and white-haired, and Dedham was lean and brown, and what hair he had left was iron gray. Sir Charles was polite and kind. Dedham talked to one like a friend. I see you're staring out the windows often at our Darien wilds. Do you see yew hedges and ivy-grown oak and cattle and sheep in green pastures? She looked down at her lap a little uneasily because she had not thought she was noticed, but there was her chance. She said, No, I see our Darien wilds. He smiled a little bit at the hour. You're settling in then, resigned to too much sun all the time except for when there's too much rain. But you haven't seen our winter yet. No, I haven't. I'm not resigned. She paused, surprised at how hard it was to say aloud, her club's first law floating above her mind. I like it. I'm not sure why, but I like it here. The smile disappeared, and he looked at her thoughtfully. Do you? He turned and looked out the window himself. There aren't many of us who do, you know. I'm one. You must have guessed that I love the desert, this desert, even in winter, and the 3 weeks of jungle after the rain stops, before the sun gets a good hold again. Quite a lot of my griping about being the oldest colonel still alive is noise only. I know that if they promoted me, they most certainly promote me away from here. It's one of the more civilized parts of this uncivilized land. Most of Dari is not like this, you know. He paused. I don't suppose that means very much to you, but it does. He frowned a little, studying her face. I don't know whether you say you're very fortunate or very unfortunate. We're strangers here, you know, even I, who've been here for 40 years. This desert is a little piece of the old Darmar. We're not even really under our jurisdiction, he smiled wryly. Not only can we not understand it, we're not able to administer it. He nodded toward the window. And the mountains beyond, they stand there, looking at you, and you know you'll never climb them. No Homelander ever has, at least, to return to tell the tale. She nodded. It is not a comfortable passion. He chuckled. No, not a comfortable passion. Is that why no one ever mentions it? One hears enough from the other side. God, don't I know. Only 496 days till I get out of the sandpit. Yes, I suppose so. It's a strange country, especially this corner of it. And if it gets too much in your blood, it makes you strange too, and you don't really want to call attention to it. She recalled the conversation as she rode, and now she saw Cassie and Beth jogging towards her. She was thinking again of Corlanth and trying to recall what little she knew of the free hill folk. Jack had been reluctant to talk about them, and his evasiveness led her to believe he knew quite a lot about them, since he was always open about saying he didn't know something. He was trying to spare her, perhaps, from the uncomfortable passion. Oh, glory, she thought with a quick leap. Her curiosity transformed itself into excitement. I do hope he's there when we get back. The question of what to tell her friends died painlessly. As soon as the ponies came abreast, Beth said, Is he here yet? Harry was expecting a good morning, and how are you, and for a moment didn't know who she meant. Cornlett, said Cassie. Jack came to our house to see Daddy before breakfast and told him to go up to the residency, that they would need him there. Mr. Peterson and Jack Dedham were the only people in the station who knew Hill speech even passably fluently. Most Darians who have had much contact with Homelanders learned Homelander. Harry had picked up a few Darien words, but only a few. No Homelander had thought to write a Darien grammar for general use, and when she inquired further, was told there was no need for her to learn it. The only person who encouraged her, who had taught her the words she did know, was Jack Dedham, and he had not the time to spare for more. Sir Charles was reasonably articulate in Darien speech, but uncomfortable about it. He felt a reasonable commissioner should know the language of those he oversees, but it made him no happier to fulfill his own expectations. He kept an interpreter near at hand. Corlanth, breathed Beth, as if the name was a charm. Daddy says the Hill folk have never liked us much. We've always known that, put in Cassie, but he'll probably slip it in and out again, and we'll never see him. I have permission to invite you to lunch, said Harry. If he's there at all, we'll see him. Oh, how wonderful. Surely he won't have finished his business before lunch. Let us not ride far. We should see something when he comes, and then we'll know when to ride back. It's very tiresome to have a real king come to visit, and no one, and not even an excuse to meet him. Do you know anything of the free hill folk? Said Harry, as they rode in an angle away from the residency where they could keep an eye on it over their shoulders. I don't. No one will tell me anything. They both laughed. The hill folk are the best kept secret in Daria, said Cassie. I mean, we know they exist. Some of them come here to the station, for the spring fair. Harry looked at her. Oh, surely Lady Amelia has told you about our fair, said Cassie. After 3 months of rains, we come out of hiding and work off our full temper by holding a fair. And there we sell to each other all the ridiculous little bags and bonnets and dolls and footstools we've made during the rain, to keep from going mad because we couldn't go out, Beth said. Yes, most of it is nonsense, but everyone is very gay for the first 2 or 3 weeks after the rain stops. The weather is cool enough. The only time all year you can even go out at midday, and there's green things growing up from the ground, and everything you own is spread on the roofs and hanging from the window sills, and they're green too, Cassie added with a grimace. We decorate the streets and the square with paper flowers and real flowers and banners and ribbons, and the whole town looks like it's on a holiday, with the dresses and blankets hanging out everywhere. We do have real flowers here besides the eternal pimchi. Although nothing like what you're used to at home, I dare say. Everything grows tremendously for 2 weeks, so on the 3rd week, fair week, everything has groomed and blossoming, even the desert, if you can believe it. Then, of course, the sun kills everything again. That's the 4th week, and you know what it's like here for the rest of the time. Yes, but the fair, everyone comes to the fair, the hill folk too, a few of them, although never anyone very special, certainly never the king. And it's not all the bead purses that our sort have been making in despair. There's always some really lovely things, mostly that the Dariums themselves have made. Even the servants aren't expected to do as much, during the rains. And after the first few weeks, you're far too cross yourself to give many orders to anyone else. But mostly the best things come up from the south. It's only way up here that the weather's so ridiculous, but the South knows about our fair, and the merchants know that when we break out of the winter prison, we're mad with freedom and more fit to buy anything, so they come up in full force. There are fairs or celebrations of spring of one kind or another all around here, but ours is the biggest. Well, said Beth, we've the biggest in things to buy and so forth, and we're the only Homelander station up here. But there's quite a number of Darien villages around here, and they take up spring very seriously. Lots of singing and dancing, that kind of thing. And they tell the most beautiful stories if you can find someone to translate into Homelander, which isn't often. And they have dancing and singing too, said Cassie. Yes, I know, said Beth slowly, but it's not the same. Our dancing is just working it off after being inside for so long. Theirs means something. Harry looked at her curiously. You mean asking the gods for a good year, that sort of thing? I suppose so, said Beth. I'm not quite sure. No one will talk about anything really Darien to Homelander, said Cassie. You must have noticed it. Yes, but I'm new here. You're always new here if you're a Homelander, said Cassie. It's different in the South, but we're on the border here, and everyone is very aware that freemen live in those hills. You can see out your windows every day. The Darians that do work for you or with you are very anxious to prove how Homelander they really are and loyal to all things Homelanders, so they don't talk, and the others won't for the opposite reason. You're beginning to sound like Daddy, said Beth. We've heard him say it often enough, Cassie responded. But the hill folk, said Harry. Yes, the one thing I suppose we all have in common is the joy in those few short weeks in spring, so a few hill folk come to our fair. They don't act very happy, though, said Beth. They come in those long robes they always wear over their faces, too, so you can't see if they're smiling or frowning, and some of them with those funny patched sashes around their waists. But they do come, and they stay several days. They have the grandest horses you've ever seen. They pitch camp outside the station, and they're always set guards quite openly, as if we weren't to be trusted. Maybe we aren't, murmured Cassie. But they never sell their horses. They bring the most gorgeous tapestries, though, and embroidered sashes, much nicer than the cut-up ones they wear themselves. These they sell. They stalk around the edge of the big central square, the old marketplace, carrying all this vivid stuff while the rest of us are laughing and talking and running around. It's a bit eerie. No, it's not, said Cassie. You listen to the stories too much. Beth blushed. After a moment she said, Did you see anything at the residency? No, said Harry. What stories? There was another Pause when Cassie looked at Beth and Beth looked at her pony's mane. My fault, said Cassie presently. We're not supposed to talk about them. Daddy gets real annoyed if he catches us. The stories are mostly about magic. Cornlith and his people are supposed to be rotten with it, even in this day and age, and Cornlith himself is supposed to be more than a little mad. Magic, said Harry, remembering what Dedham had said earlier. Mad? He hasn't said anything about madness. How? They both shrugged. We never managed to find out, said Cassie. And we usually wring what we wanted to know out of Daddy eventually, said Beth, so it must be something pretty dreadful. Cassie laughed. You read too many novels, Beth. It's just as likely that Daddy won't talk about it because he refuses to admit it might be real. The magic, I mean. Jack Dedham believes it, and he and Daddy argue about it sometimes when they don't really think anyone else is around. The madness, if that's what it is tied up somehow to the king's strength. In return for having power beyond mortal men or something, he has to pay a price of some kind of mad fits. Who reads too many novels, said Beth, and Cassie grinned. It does rather catch the imagination, she said, and Beth nodded. No wonder you're so eager to set eyes on him, said Harry. Yes, I know it's silly of me, but I feel perhaps it'll show somehow. Maybe he's 8 feet tall and has a third eye in the middle of his forehead, said Beth. Heaven, said Harry. I hope not, said Cassie. Well, you know how the legend goes, says Beth. No, not really, said her sister repressively. Even when Daddy is willing to translate some, you can tell by the pauses that he's leaving a lot out. Yes, but even so, said Beth, the old kings and queens are supposed to be taller than mortal. The Darians are mostly shorter than we are, at least the ones we see, said Cassie. A king would look quite ordinary to us and very tall for them. And you can tell royal blood by something about the eyes. There was another pause. Harry said, something? Again they both shrugged. Something, said Beth. That's one of the things Daddy always leaves out, like the madness. You're hoping he'll froth at the mouth, said Cassie. Beth threw a peevish look at his sister. No, I'd settle for a third eye. This conversation had taken them well away from the outlying houses of the station, and the dust kicked up by their ponies' feet was giving them the pretense of being anything other than desert sand. A silence fell. Cassie suggested a canter, which was duly accomplished. The sun was hot enough that when they pulled back only after a few minutes, the pony's shoulders were wet with sweat. Harry set another of her long looks across the desert and had to squint against the shivering light. Do you think we might turn back now? Beth asked wistfully, shading her eyes with her elegantly white-gloved hand. Harry grinned. We can spend the rest of the morning in my sitting room if you like. It looks over the front door, you know. Harry gave her a grateful look. Cassie chuckled, and they all three turned their ponies around with dispatch and sent them jogging quickly as the heat would allow. By the time they reached the suggestion of shade offered by the thin, determined trees marking the outskirts of the station proper, Harry was hot and slightly headachy and cross with herself for rushing back for no reason. Nothing could have escaped their notice. The residency stood a little apart from the rest of the station in its own grounds, and a road that ended at its front door had been under their eyes for the entire ride. They'd been gone for a little over an hour. Harry considered suggesting they meet again after another hour, time enough to change and have a bath. In her present condition, she didn't feel like meeting any kings, mad or otherwise. But she stole a glance at Beth, and she saw how anxious she was not to miss anything. She thought, oh well, I can wash my face at least, and we can all have some cold lemonade and watch the front door in comfort. The horses walked slowly up the street to the residency. Cassie pulled off her hat and found herself with it. Harry shut her eyes for a moment. An execrable habit, she told the inside of her eyelids. What if this fat, sleepy four-poster with ears and a tail should bolt or shy suddenly? What if the sky should fall? Responded the inside of her eyelids. The forward poster stopped dead in the air in the road and raised its head a few inches, just as Beth said in a strangled whisper, Look. Harry and Cassie looked. They had come nearly to the end of the road, what was left was the broad circle in front of the residency, suitable for turning carriages in, or forming up half a regiment. Off to one side, where the tall house cast a little shade, 7 horses and 1 man stood. The horses stood in a little semicircle around the man, who sat cross-legged near the wall of the house. They stood quietly, stamping a foot now and then. Occasionally one would put out its nose to touch the man, and he would stroke its cheek a moment. He would raise its head. The first thing Harry noticed was that the beauty of these horses. Not one was less than 16 hands high, with long, clean legs and tails that nearly touched the ground. 3 were chestnuts, their coats shining even in the dusty shadow. one grey, one dark bay, one golden dun, but the finest horse stood farthest from the 3 fat ponies standing foolishly in the carriage drive. He was blood bay, as red as fire, with black legs and tail. He stood aloof from the other horses and ignored the man at his feet. He stared back at the newcomers as if it were his land he stood on and they were the intruders. As the other horses started slowly swinging their heads around to see what their leader was looking at, Harry noticed something else. There were no bridles. "He's here," said Cassie flatly. Beth held a deep breath. "How?" she said. "Look at those horses," said Harry, and the longing in her voice was so clear that even she heard it. Cassie looked away from the impossible sight of 7 horses that had made their way invisibly across a bleak desert right in front of 3 people who were looking for them, and smiled with sympathy at her friend. "Haven't you ever seen a hill horse before? They're supposed to be the finest in Daria." "And they never sell them," said Harry, remembering. Cassie nodded, although Harry's eyes never left the horses. Jack Dedham would give an arm even to ride one once. "No bridle," said Harry. "No stirrups either," said Cassie, and Harry saw that this was true. They wore saddles that were little more than padded skins cut and elaborately rolled. She could see the gleam of embroidery on girth and pommels. Not a horse moved from its place in the semicircle, although all now, with the man, watched the 3 ponies and their riders. "Horses," said Beth disgustedly. "Don't you understand what they mean? They mean that he's not here, and we never noticed. They mean that he's here already, and we never noticed a thing. If that's not magic, what is?" She prodded her pony forward again. Cassie and Harry followed slowly and stopped before the steps. The 3 stable boys appeared, ready to take the ponies back to the stable behind the house. Harry's feet had only just touched the ground, the boy hovering anxiously to one side, since he had learned through bitter experience that this Homelander did not wish to be assisted while dismounting. Then there was a commotion at the entrance to the house. Harry turned around in time to see the heavy door thrown violently open so that its hinges protested, and out strode a man dressed in loose white robes with a scarlet sash around his waist. Several more figures started out in his wake and collected round him where he paused at the veranda. He was the axis of a nervous wheel, moving its head slowly to examine the lesser people who turned around him and squeaked at him without daring to come too close. With a shock, Harry realized that 4 of these small mortals, Sir Charles and Mr. Peterson, Jack Dedham, and her own brother Richard. The man in white was tall, although no taller than Richard or Sir Charles, but there was a quivering in the air around him, like the heat haze over the desert, and shed from his white sleeves, cast off by the shadows of his scarlet sash. Those who stood near him looked small and pale and vague, while this man was so bright he hurt the eyes. More men came quietly out behind the Homelanders and stood a little to one side, but they kept their eye on their king. He could be no one else. This must be Corlynth. Harry took a deep breath. He didn't look insane or inhuman. He did look uncooperative. He shook his head and frowned at something someone said, and Sir Charles looked very unhappy. Corlynth shrugged and made a sweeping movement with his arms, like a man coming out of a forest gratefully into the sunlight. He took a long step forward to the edge of the veranda. Then Dedham took 2 quick steps toward him and spoke to him a few words only, urgently. Corlynth turned again, as it seemed unwillingly, and looked back. Dedham held out his hand, palms down, fingers spread, so they stood for a long minute. Corlynth dropped his eyes to the hand stretched towards him, and he looked into the face of the owner. Harry watched, feeling her breath without knowing why. The nasty feeling in the pit of her stomach, she saw a look of terrible strain across Dedham's face as the Hill King held his glaze, and outstretched hand trembled very slightly. Corlynth slowly reached out his own hand and touched the back of Dedham's wrist with 2 fingers. The hand dropped to Dedham's side once more, as if it were heavy as stone, and the man slumped in relief like a murderer reprieved at the scaffold. The look of strain slid off his face, as replaced by one of great weariness. Corlynth swung around again and set his foot at the top stair, and no one moved to stop him. 5 men in the loose robes of hillfolk separated themselves from the veranda shadows and came to follow. Harry found she could not take her eyes off the king. but from the corner of her eyes she noticed that the other men wore vivid sashes, gold and orange and green and blue and purple. There was nothing to indicate the king but the glitter of his presence. Harry stood only a few feet from the bottomless step, holding her pony bridle. Cassie and Beth were somewhere behind her, and the stable boy stood frozen a few steps from her elbow. Corlith still had not noticed them, and Harry stared fascinated as he came nearer. There seemed a roaring in the air that beat her eardrums and pressed against her eyeballs till she blinked. Then he looked up abruptly, as if from some unfathomable depth of thought, and saw her. Their eyes met. The man's eyes were yellow as gold, and hot liquid gold in a smelter's furnace. Harry found it suddenly difficult to breathe, and understood the expression on Deb Hen's face. She almost staggered. Her hand tightened on the bridle, and the pony dropped its head and mouthed a bit uncomfortably. The heat was incredible. It was as though 1,000 desert suns beat down on her. Magic? She thought from inside the thunder. Is this what magic is? I come from a cold country, where the witches live in cold green forests. What am I doing here? She saw the anger under them the man was holding in check, the anger staring at her through the yellow eyes and swept through the glistening white robes. Then it was over. He looked away. He came down the last steps and passed her as if she did not exist, and she cowered out of his way so that no corner of his white sleeve would touch her. The man with the horses emerged from the shade, riding one of the chestnuts, and the 6 others went up to the riders and nuzzled them. The blood bay reached the king first and greeted him with a low whinny. Corlith mounted with an easy leap. Harry could not even follow with her eyes, although she could see anger informing the set of his legs against the great stallion's sides. The horse folded to without moving. All its muscles were suddenly taut, and its stillness was the quiet before the battle. The other men mounted. Corlith never looked at them, but the red stallion plunged forward at a gallop, and the other men followed, and the sound of the horse's hoofs made on the hard earth suddenly reminded Harry how unnaturally silent everyone had been since Dedham's last words. The inaudible thunder faded with the sight of the colored sashes and the bright flanks of the hill horses. Harry woke up to who she was and where. Sir Charles and Jack and Mr. Peterson looked their normal size again, and she had a raging headache.